So the first panel that Salil ran was professional CEOs who were brought in to run an open source company. We're now going to have a different panel with founding technology CEOs who've continued to run their company. And Salil will be moderating. We'd like to invite Andi Gutmans, the founder of Zend and the creator of PHP, onto the stage. Also Luke Kanies, who created Puppet and is the CEO of Puppet Labs, and Jason Van Zyl, who's the creator of Maven, and had first created Sonatype to monetize that, and is now doing that at Takari, if that's right. So if you all could come up on stage, we'll get this panel going.
Okay, so Ben gave you brief intros of all these guys. So again, in order here, Jason Van Zyl created something called Maven, which was a couple of things. It was a build system for Java, and it was also a component repository in the cloud for all Java components. And it had approximately 100% market share of Java component artifact management and build systems. So one of the things I want to talk to him about is why was it still hard to monetize? Andi Gutmans was the creator of PHP and created a company called Zend around PHP. And Luke Kanies created Puppet and the company Puppet Labs. But I want to start with Jason. Jason's actually no longer with the company that he founded and created. And so I would really love to hear your candid story of this personal journey part, as much as you can share.
Sure. Yeah, I have no problems being candid. So my background from a long time ago was in scientific computing. I did a lot of software development. I don't think anyone would ever call me a people person, but there's more people developing software than working in a lab in an underground basement with no windows. So I did a lot of software development. I usually helped on a lot of the infrastructure projects that other people had in the labs. I had something that was like Maven written in C to try and help physicists writing their software. It eventually turned into something that I wrote in Java. I became involved in the Apache Software Foundation probably 14, maybe 15 years ago, working on one of the first web app frameworks there in Java called Turbine, which predated Struts, a scripting language called Velocity. Working on Maven came out of the horrible experience that volunteers would come to the organization and not be able to actually build or work on the projects. And that evolved, and companies started to adopt it in Europe first, Norway and France in particular. My parents are architects and city planners. I've grown up with a lot of ideas of social capital, Jane Jacobs, Christopher Alexander, design patterns. And so a lot of the same ideas went into Maven, which is why I believe it was adopted first in Europe and then in North America. So I worked on that for a couple of years, and it was purely driven by customers that started using it that asked me to form a company. Companies here in California. I came here, we started building the company. I got the Series A funding from Hunter Winblad and Morgenthaler. And this is really a story of someone who is like purely technical, not great at business, probably not great with people. I've evolved into something that I have a little more business savvy, I would say, maybe a little bit better with people, maybe a little bit better at business. And I went through this version of the company where I was doing everything myself, had 5 or 10 people, took a Series A of funding. The company struggled for a while. We ended up hiring a professional CEO. We had diverging opinions. I ended up leaving that company, and I'll try and step through that process there. But to me, at the beginning, it was amazing that someone would give me $4 million to actually work on the open source project. And I think what some of the initial success was is what everyone has talked about. I pretty much invested all of that money in the open source projects. It was probably something that I shouldn't have done with all of it, but the projects grew. We had a number of open source projects that were related to Maven. One of them that came out of it, if you consider Maven to be, say, the robot that builds things. Maven Central is a store of components, and the robot goes and grabs components from the component store and builds your applications. This repository has taken on a life of its own. It'll probably have about 15 billion requests this year. It's sort of become the de facto standard in the Java or the JVM community of where you get things. We built one product that we started selling, so this is what we monetized. I think we made the mistake of not trying to actually cater to the customers who wanted to pay something for the open source project. We never tried to sell really support or training for Maven itself at all. And the counter to that, in the new company we started, after about 6 months, I've done a deal for about $750,000 that's purely support and work on the open source projects. So this was a failing that we didn't do in the first or in Sonatype. So Sonatype struggled to meet the revenue goals that were set out by the board. I never intended to run the company. It took us a long time to actually find a CEO that I got along with. It was 19 in total that I interviewed before we actually hired one. His name was Wayne Jackson. He has a security background. He's a very smart guy. He's a professional CEO. I think he intended to do what the board wanted and tried to monetize and turn the company into a business. But we had different ideas. So I wanted to continue working on the open source side of things, working on building and developing software. And I guess I'm out of time. So yeah, all right. And so really what happened is it probably needed more time to develop. But with the bringing in of a new CEO, he had an idea about how the company should work and what products we should make, and they diverged there. So advice for anybody, definitely the hires that you make. So I can pinpoint the problems in the company to the 6th hire that I made. The hiring of a professional CEO, not that there's anything, Wayne is a great guy, it's just we had different ideas about, he wanted to have a security company based on open source, and I wanted to go down the path of provisioning and deploying production runtimes. And so that ended up diverging mostly because Sonatype may succeed as a security company, but it will fail as an open source company. And there was probably 5 people who have said it today, is that we basically stopped funding the open source projects. It was me that was left to work on Maven and some of the other open source projects, and we basically abandoned all of our other projects and sort of tried to make it look like we didn't, but in fact we actually did. So that was probably that will probably be the downfall of Sonatype as an open source company, though they may be successful as a security company. But for me, I sided with the users of the community that I started. So someone may never invest in me again, but that's the path that I took and sort of abandoned the company that I started to continue doing the work that I love doing and just continued with the community that I started.
Yeah, I think we'll want to hear more about that in the second 5 minutes. So Andy's got also an interesting story because Andy, you created PHP. And
one of the co-architects.
One of 2, right?
3.
One of 3. And then you created Zend, and it's been 10 years or so.
So I've been involved with PHP 17 years.
Well, no, Zend.
Oh yeah, Zend has been about 13 years.
Yeah. And so it's been a long, long road, and the industry has changed so much during that time. So it's a little hard to track the steps you made because the times at which you took those steps, times were different. And so talk a little bit about going from the creation of PHP to its massive popularity, and then trying to create a company around it and trying to monetize.
Okay. Sounds great. I have 2 sections, right?
Yeah, you have this first 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to you, and questions.
So I have a few slides. I may use
them.
them.
Right.
I think I'm the only one here. But I'm actually going to tell the story in 2 parts. I think the first part is actually the open source part. I think that part is incredibly important because if you don't, what open source really helps you do is build the addressable market that you can monetize. And I think it was Martin Mikos or one of the previous speakers talked about the 2 faces of the company. every open source company has the two phases. The first phase, which is creating the addressable market. The second one is about monetizing the market. So I'll talk about the addressable market first. Later on, I'll talk about what it actually takes to monetize, because those are two very different stories, and both of them have challenges and opportunities. Just a bit about myself. Computer science graduate. I barely graduated. One of the reasons was I prefer coding than studying. And that actually played into my work in PHP, and I'll talk about why. I love Java, but not the Java you think. This is my creation at home. I'm a coffee enthusiast, and this is a real-life picture from my kitchen. So co-architect of PHP, quad citizen. The last one was the US. Zend stands for Zev and Andi. The Zend engine is the kernel of PHP. So like the JVM is to Java, the Zend engine is to PHP. That's what we worked on. And it's not only the PHP that I worked on, we actually jump-started a number of open source projects and also contributed a bit to MySQL and to the Apache web server. So I've done quite a few things in open source. I wanted to talk a bit about from open source to enterprise, because I think that's actually what defines your addressable market. Just doing open source without thinking of the monetization strategy is not going to work. You have to think about what's the market you're trying to build. And when we started, there really wasn't much of a web market. It was 1997. Perl was a big thing on the web. I don't think most people here barely remember Perl. Alera Cold Fusion, which was later acquired by Macromedia and Adobe, did well. We had to do some of our coding on a 14.4K baud modem. Once in a while, we got a 2400 dial-up connection. By the way, I'm a C developer, not a PHP developer. And webmasters were usually the dumb guys, right? No computer science graduate was actually willing to write the web application. I don't know if you guys remember that. If you had a computer science degree, you were doing C, C++, or Java. You were not doing PHP, you were not doing Perl. So, the guy before that mentioned PHP, isn't such a great language. The real success of PHP is that it actually applies to such a broad base of developers that enabled, Mark Zuckerberg to build a multi-billion-dollar company. And that actually continues to be true today. The main difference is computer science graduates have gotten on top of dynamic languages, on top of languages like PHP. And of course, the secret to those many years is we continue to innovate and make sure the platform was relevant and ready for enterprise, and I'll talk about that. The key driver to us actually working on PHP was we hated studying. So Zev and I, we had a physics, we had our physics finals coming up, we had our numerical analysis finals coming up. We tried to get an extra credit project. We found a professor that's willing to let us write a shopping cart. Back in 1997, that was a big deal. So instead of studying for these tests, we actually started working on this shopping cart project. Zev was working at an ISP. He found a language called PHP-FI through the ISP he was working for, and we started by building the shopping cart with PHP-FI. We really liked the idea, but we just finished a compilation course, and we realized that language could be so much more powerful. So we stopped studying. We started working on a new runtime. That actually ended up becoming what is known today as PHP 3, or what used to be called PHP 3. That was really the version that started creating a huge following in the open source market. I'd say there was one thing we did really well with PHP 3. We created an API that made it incredibly easy for developers to contribute to the project and build extensions into a lot of different databases. Zev actually wrote the MySQL database extension, later on Sybase and other extensions that came out. But it was really that API. And there's one thing you should remember about open source. It's actually only a very small amount of people who typically innovate at the core. And thinking that you're just going to put this thing out there and 1,000 developers are going to come and innovate your core is really not the way open source works. But if you can create opportunities for people to add value through APIs and through ways to contribute around the fringes, that's when you get the big multiplier effect. So PHP 3 really created a big multiplier effect. About a year after we shipped PHP 3, we came to the conclusion that what we built was pretty bad, and we started working on PHP 4. PHP 4 is when we introduced the Zend engine. We basically moved to a compile first, execute later model. PHP 4 added another very important piece of the puzzle. We started thinking about monetization. I'll talk about it a bit later on. But as part of the monetization model, we added an API inside that would enable us to plug in value-add capabilities around performance, monitoring, and so on and so forth. So PHP 3 and PHP 4 really started taking off in 2001. Yahoo standardized on PHP. Okay, PHP today runs at the low end 40% of the web. Google has that number at about 75% of the web, so it's a very big part of the web, 240 million websites. And I'm supposed to be done in a second, but just a couple of last things. We got huge adoption, but it was still not a monetizable market. And that's why I said there was a big market. There were 20 million websites at the time, but it wasn't ready for enterprise. And so as a company, we started investing in really making PHP enterprise grade. We added PHP 5 with a very strong object model. We built the best practices into Zend framework, so we launched an enterprise grade framework, and we started to work in 2005 with IBM, Oracle, and Microsoft to build connectivity to DB2, to Oracle, SQL Server, WebSphere. And this is a slide you should remember because it's great if you have a successful open source project, but if it's not consumable by enterprise, you're not going to make the big bucks. And so it was about, in 2005, I would say about 5 years after we started, where we actually made those investments that moved PHP from being a very broadly used project to being a project that was really ready to go very, very deep into enterprise and run some very big workloads. So last slide, here are just some examples of companies who've built very, very big workloads on PHP. Fiat has over 5 billion euros going through a PHP application every year. Disney has pretty much standardized on PHP and Zend framework. Apple has quite a bit of its backend running on PHP. So if you're using an iPhone, at some point, you're actually going to connect to some PHP API in the backend. So there's a lot of big iron companies now who've been using PHP. And that really was enabled by those investments that moved it from a cool, successful project to being a project that really had all the capabilities enterprise needed.
So after hearing Jason and Andy's struggles to monetize, it seems like it's been smooth sailing for you, Luke. You just keep raising more and more money at higher and higher valuations. So maybe you can talk briefly about how you created Puppet. And Puppet itself is a fork of CF Engine, or there's some connection there, but maybe you should explain that. And then just talk about how you created the company and the current state of it, how much money you've raised, whatever's public.
Yeah, so I was a sysadmin by trade. I have a chemistry degree, and like Andy, I took much more pleasure from breaking my computer than from studying, and so in the course of figuring out how to fix it quickly, became reasonable at doing sysadmin-like stuff to kind of turn that into a career. Hated the job and tried to automate my way out of every job, and eventually that led to kind of consulting, learning all the other tools in this space, and at some point I basically decided to stop being a sysadmin. I was done with the work. I couldn't find jobs I enjoyed. I kind of hated it in almost every way, and figured that the best way to exit appropriately was to build a project that would allow me to kind of take what I thought I knew about system administration and kind of encapsulate it into a product that then other people could use. So ironically, Puppet was my way of getting out of system administration. It worked out fantastically. Unlike the vast majority of software projects, of open source projects, I started a company and the project at the same time. So I didn't start Puppet and then try to figure out how to monetize. I don't really ever use words like monetize. My goal is to build a great software company, and a significant chunk of what we build is open source. But my job is to figure out how to pay engineers, and the reason I want to pay engineers is I want to build something, and I'm trying to solve a specific problem in a specific space. And to do that, it turns out the vast majority of people just won't work for free. So to be able to pay them, I have to convince people to pay me. To convince people to pay me, I have to build something people want to buy. That's fundamentally my problem, and it's not an open source problem. It's not a commercial problem. It's not a software problem. It's a let's say you'd like somebody to pay you problem. It just so happens that the vast majority of the IP that Puppet Labs owns is open source. And that puts specific constraints on what we can and can't do. And realistically, like Jason was saying, there's a certain amount of pissing off your user base you also can't do. And so in terms of other projects, Puppet was a from-scratch implementation. It was the first systems tool that I know of that was written in Ruby. It was written before anybody was using Rails or anything like that. So it was a relatively stupid decision to write it in Ruby at the time. If Rails hadn't come along, no one would know what Ruby was and probably wouldn't know what we are, but we got kind of lucky. It doesn't feel as lucky today now that we're doing test matrices against 5 incompatible versions of Ruby. But at the time, it worked out pretty well. And for the first 3 years, it was just me. And I had been a consultant on CF Engine, and so I had built my reputation kind of in the general configuration management CF Engine community, and was, I think, the second largest contributor to CF Engine at the time. It's hard to know because the author of CF Engine didn't use version control at the time, so I can't track actual contributions. So when I started Puppet, I thought about doing a fork, and I actually built a fork at one point, but then I decided to start from scratch. CF Engine was written in C. I wanted to write something that was better programmer productivity. First 3 years, it was just me, brought on 2 people, and I was primarily doing consulting because that was what I knew. I knew how to do it. I knew how to make a living at it, and turns out I enjoy eating. And so I did whatever I could to make money. The goal was always to build a software company. I knew I wanted to pay engineers. I didn't really care how I got the money. It turns out the best way to get money to pay engineers is to sell software. So by 2009, True Ventures invested in us. And they invested in us because we had a pretty large community at that point. Big companies like Google were using Puppet at scale. And it was pretty clear that it was the kind of the spearhead of an interesting movement. And from there, we've grown from 3 people, we're about 275 now. We've raised about $46 million in 4 rounds of funding. And we've always been about 2, maybe 3/4 from profitability. So we earn a lot of money. A lot of people pay us a lot of money because they like our software. And in most cases, they aren't paying us for open source. A lot of what they get is open source. But realistically, our fundamental challenge as a company is, can I build software that people are willing to pay for? And some of it feels a little bit like charity. And our early purchases were very much people saying, I like you, and therefore here's a check. People don't really write 7-figure checks because they like you. And so these days it's much more, but why would I pay you? But why would I pay you? But why would I pay you? And I have to have a good answer for that. And again, I'm not trying to monetize open source. I'm trying to build a software company which happens to produce a lot of open source. Open source is strategically important to us. Similar to as Jason was saying, I want my open source to be spread like peanut butter across the universe so that people change how they work, they change what they do, they change their expectations from their infrastructure, they change their expectations from their vendors. And then I can plug all those tens of millions, hundreds of millions of devices that are running Puppet into my software, much of which is open source. You don't have to use our commercial software, but you'll be much happier and better off if you do. And so that's kind of how I think about us as a business, is how do we build great software that people want to pay for, and how do we make sure that we never build shitty open source software. To me, this is the fundamental challenge. Every open source company goes through but why don't we just make our open source shitty, and then people have to pay us for the good stuff? And that's like, to me, this is the major thing that defines, are you a bad citizen or a good one? And too many people decide that we're going to ignore it, or we're going to buy bad stuff, or things like that. And the fundamental constraint in being a good company that produces open source is, how can you align your incentives internally so that all of your software is good and not just the stuff people pay for? And that is what I find to be the biggest challenge. And finding people to pay you for things is easy, but are they paying you for things you want to be paid for?
Oh, this is cool. Jason, just seemed like you had more things to get off your chest.
I think it dovetails with what Luke was saying, is that if you want it to proliferate, you have to write good software for people to use. And I think trying to do otherwise just ends up, it will be the source of your demise. And I think in any company who's probably tried to do that, at least for us or for Sonatype, it was highly visible that we weren't either producing anything anymore, or what we were producing was not very good.
Didn't you also have the problem that build systems and component repositories are hard to monetize?
Yeah, I think when the one product that we did have, so there is the centralized component repository that all or most Java open source projects submit their components to. Every enterprise wanted to have their own internal repository for tracking their own components, and that's what became our product. There we really created the market. It's essentially the way station for the binary components that you make that developers will either turn around and consume again, or that you will actually provision your production runtimes with the things that are stored in this component repository, this commercial private component repository. And I don't think we waited long enough. We basically created that market and then basically abandoned that project. Like, so if you had invested in my Series A, we may still be working on it, and that may have developed. And it needed to mature and proliferate, and we just didn't give it the time to do it, really.
Let's take a question from the audience. I'm surprising the audience here, but yeah, go ahead.
Last point that you made, how about that? Last point that you made about incentives aligning, I want to hear more. There's stuff behind that. So what are some of the things that you've done to solve that challenge that you have?
Yeah, the question is, what are some things I've done to solve the challenge of aligning incentives internally? And to give you one example, so Puppet's written in Ruby today. Ruby is slow, it's unstable, it's hard to maintain, it's easy to test, but it's hard to be confident in the results of the tests. And it turns out one of the things that a lot of our customers want is they want better speed, they want better stability, they want better scale. So one of the things that we could do as a company is rewrite critical parts of Puppet in C or C++ or Go, as long as we don't want it to run on any of our customers' actual platforms, and charge for that rewritten version, and then have the open source be the slow, crappy, hard to test version. And we're not doing that. We are going to rewrite Puppet in a compiled language, chunk by chunk, but we're going to open source those rewrites. And I'm making sure that our product strategy hopefully wins if our customers have if every user of Puppet has a better, faster, stronger version of the core tooling, and then we can build our wider application strategy on, but what happens if everyone has a better experience? What happens in this world? And in that world, we get more users, we get more adoption, we get more code written in Puppet, we get a larger percentage of the world's infrastructure being managed by Puppet. And the question then is, can we build a product that is fantastically valuable to all these millions of people who are using Puppet? And that becomes a much more interesting challenge than how can I convince enough people to use our horrible software that I can then monetize them with good software? But it's surprising how easy it is for the conversation to fall into, well, we can't afford to do that because then it'll hurt our ability to monetize. Then it'll hurt our ability to sell software. And so you just kind of have to draw top-down, very high-level lines and say, we can't do this, we have to do this, and otherwise it's a super slippery slope. And again, every time you lose a deal, you always lose deals. Everyone loses deals. There's no company out there that doesn't lose deals. And if you aren't, your prices aren't high enough. So you're going to lose deals, and every time you lose a deal, you lost a deal for a specific reason. And for us, that reason is always, every time, functionally every single time, it's because our open source software is too good. Every time. Right? So we have to make sure that we're incentivized to continue doing that, even though it literally costs, it doesn't literally cost us money. We could make a lot more money if we didn't do that. And it's tough to do, but you can always tell when you've done it, because suddenly all these fights you're having, all these struggles, they go away, and everyone wakes up every day, does the work they're supposed to do, and everyone's much happier. Sales guys are never happy, but everyone else is pretty happy.
So what exactly do you sell?
So Puppet Enterprise is it's the server-side portion. So essentially, when you buy Puppet Enterprise, you're buying client access to our centralized server. And most of the code in that server today is open source. So the core engines are all the open source engines. But in addition to that core engine, we have the way we've built it, the fact that we've tested it and certified it against all the platforms you actually care about. If you've got an OS you're not embarrassed to admit that you run, we run on it. So it's the getting it set up, getting it configured, getting it tested, getting it actually We know it works. We know these specific versions. Again, the specific sub version of Ruby with that compiled version on that platform may or may not segfault. We know that these ones all actually work. Plus, there's additional functionality that's only available as part of the commercial version. So it's some combination of the platform stability and configuration and the additional functionality on top. Over time, so our company's 9 years old. Again, we've always been a software company. We've never not been. There was never a point where I decided to make a real company of it. And if you really like to offend me, it'd be great to come up and say, so when did you decide to make a real company? Starting in 2005, I quit a 6-figure job to work on this full time, and I haven't been paid $1 since 2005 that wasn't based on Puppet. So it has been my life and my job for a long time. But 2011 was the first time we released a commercial product. So it's a young product with a much older project, and figuring out, it's not monetization, it's what's the product market fit for Puppet Enterprise. And we're early there. In 3 years and 5 years, you'll see a lot more completely independent, completely commercial software that's entirely compatible with our open source ecosystem built into the commercial product.
I'm going to ask Andy in just a minute what Zend sells, but I had a follow-up question. When True funded you, you had a choice of where to build the company, and you chose Portland, Oregon.
So when True funded us, I have no idea what they were doing. I had 10-month-old identical twin daughters. I had been living in Nashville for 10 years. My wife got her PhD. I had never been a developer. I'd never been a manager. I'd never worked with a developer. And I had never worked for a manager who really taught me anything at all useful about being a manager. And I, under no circumstances, made promises to move to the Bay Area. My goal was always to get back to the West Coast, but I was paying myself $96,000 a year. There's no way that a family of 4 can live on $96,000 a year in a place that you would like to actually live in the Bay Area. And so just kind of structurally speaking, I was unwilling to commit to the treadmill that was the Bay. I love Portland. I went to school there. I felt like Portland was an undervalued stock. Like there was a lot of great latent awesomeness about Portland that the rest of the world didn't see, and I could kind of time the market and get in there early. In some cases, it's been fantastic. It's hard to argue with our situation and our status. In some cases, it's been bad. It's hard to say. These same things wouldn't be horrible and awesome about the Bay Area, but I'm very confident I would have horrific, ridiculous horrificness here and also some great stuff. So I'm pretty happy with the compromise I've made, and it's worked out pretty well for us.
Andy, what does Zend sell? So we talked 2 different times, I think, earlier that it's hard to monetize a language. So talk about how you're trying to monetize around PHP.
One quick point on my thing. I'm lucky enough to have picked a space where all of our customers have budgets. They actually are used to just spending money and on almost everything. And just that decision makes my life so much easier than these guys who have to try to convince developers who have no money to spend money on stuff. So step 1, pick your market correctly.
So that's a good one. And I'll talk about personas in a second because we actually have different kinds of personas, which I think you also do in your deals, right? The folks who are actually picking up the open source are not necessarily the guys who are gonna write the big check. But we sell Zend Server. Zend Server is an application platform for PHP. We add a lot of, I would say, ilities on top of PHP. So scalability, clustering, security, monitoring, automation. So anything you need to go from kind of more of an ad hoc PHP deployment to really having a production-ready, cloud-ready deployment. So the key monetization strategy for us is actually runtime monetization. We have a lot of proprietary differentiation. So, our value prop is open source support. So we do the Red Hat-like long-term support, and we support the PHP stack. But we actually came to the conclusion we need a lot of proprietary value add. And for us, drawing the line is pretty easy. I would say that we invest a lot in PHP. We invest a lot in that ecosystem and addressable market. We really think about it as, as you're running a business-critical application in a mid-market to enterprise company, which are also the companies who happen to be able to pay you some money. Those are the capabilities that we really spend money on. A couple of interesting things just as far as open source monetization. If you look at the Splunk freemium model, right, it's all around capacity-based pricing. Yep. In open source, capacity-based pricing, generally speaking, doesn't work because the open source bits are out there. And that's why we really differentiate on 3 key factors. One is features, SLA, and then a certain level of data retention within our monitoring and other, our other proprietary environments, and how much information to actually show the customer. The cloud is changing the game a bit, where we actually are going to a model where we can do capacity-based pricing. So I'd say from an open source perspective, cloud starts to be very interesting because we can actually start doing proprietary pricing. Now, two more things just as far as thinking about an open source monetization strategy, and we do think about it as monetization, is
I just want to make money.
yeah, we have a we have a freemium model, but freemium model for us is very interesting because your free has to be better than the open source, but it has to be less good than your premium. So we actually have two levels of differentiation we need to think about. Is one, how do we get folks to actually go and get our free version, because we want them to discover all the great things we have, and we don't want them to have to rip out their stack like the Apache guy mentioned before, right, Mark? He said that one of their challenges at, Covalent was that customers had to rip out their stack. We want them to start on our free stack. So one is we actually have two levels of differentiation we have to think about. The second thing is we have multiple personas we have to think about. We really care about the developers. We want them to be engaged with the customer, with the product. I would say both developers and DevOps. But the guy who's signing the check, the guy who can pay tens of thousands of dollars a year, is not the developer. It's the head of development, the head of operations. So you need to make sure that as you think about your product strategy, there are areas of value for the different personas that are part of your selling cycle.
So when I was starting Puppet Labs, I thought, I will build an open source company, and it'll be easy to sell software. I'll just copy one of these great models like companies like Red Hat, and it took me a while to realize that no one else had actually built a lot of revenue by giving away most of their key development. And one of the things that I realized relatively recently is there are functionally no examples of people building great open source companies, or even great, like, mediocre open source companies by open sourcing their core innovation. Open source is great at certain things in the market. And then people misunderstand Red Hat's model. People think Red Hat sells support. They don't. Red Hat sells insurance. When you pay $1 million a year to Red Hat, you're betting $1 million that you're going to have something blow up in your infrastructure this year that will cost you more than $1 million, right? Just like when you buy life insurance, you're betting the insurance company that you're going to die, and they're going to have to give you a check, and they're betting that you won't die. So Red Hat, you're paying for insurance, not for support. And if they never call you, you're still getting your value. Most companies can't sell insurance on open source. And then, again, they don't talk about it like that externally, but internally, that's functionally how Red Hat thinks about it. So when you think about what you're selling, most people won't buy support. They aren't that interested. I'm not saying you can't sell any, but I am saying you can't. It's much harder to scale that business. And Red Hat went public as a t-shirt and mug company. So they got a lot of time to figure out what their model was, and they got to the point where they would be really, really ubiquitous before they had to really figure out what their business was. Most people don't get that many years, don't get to be public before they know what their business is. So it's a tough model to follow. I'm not saying no one will ever do what Red Hat does, but it's tough to look at that and go, hey, that's a model I can copy. I was about 4 years in before I realized how uncopyable that model was. But it turns out that you got to find somebody. One of the things I don't want to innovate on is business models. I would like to create as little new stuff as possible, and there aren't that many new business models to be made. And so it changed our strategy quite a bit looking at it like that.
Okay, we're out of time. Maybe one question, a burning question that someone has. I'm gonna cut it off, not let people. Okay, it better be good though.
When's the last time either of you wrote a line of code?
Oh, geez.
So what I discovered as a CEO is being a software developer was really useful in Excel. I'm actually one of the best Excel coders in a company. So a lot of our revenue models and stuff like that, I mean, the finance, of course, does their work, but I would say that actually coding capability really helped me when I started moving more into the financial side of the business and the analytics side of really understanding what are the underlying trends in the business. So being a coder does help you, even if you're not writing web code.
I still do a lot of prototyping. If you look in my Puppet repository on my GitHub account, there are a bunch of branches that I'm still haranguing my team about when they're going to either duplicate that work or find a way to merge it in. I also use Puppet to manage my home directory, and so when I build up a new machine, or I am starting up a VM to do testing on, then the first thing I do is install Puppet and then use Puppet to configure my home directory so that all my SSH keys and all that stuff is all set up. So I edited that last week or the week before. I don't know if it was a writing line of code, but I'll call it that.
Yeah, that qualifies.
Lunchtime.
All right. Thank you, guys. This was awesome. Thank you very much. Jason, Andy, and Luke.